My name is Jim Klo. I'm from the Tamadish Foundation. Basically, it's a foundation that works with LGBTIQ plus youths. Yeah, so we give them programs in terms of like dialogues, and we also work with service providers where we help them understand LGBTIQ plus issues through sensitization trainings. Yeah. And it's very important to start including LGBTI people in business spaces because to start with, as LGBTI people, I mean like we've got the highest law of the country that says it's okay to be who you are, but we still know that like on the ground people still get discriminated. People to get into business spaces where they have to go to interviews and things like that. That gender presentation might not meet somebody's unconscious biasm or also like just by being themselves, it's very difficult to make it into the business sector and things like that. So the business taking up spaces that says it needs to affirm its people, it needs to affirm its workers that it's okay to be who you are and be more pronounced about it, that being LGBTI doesn't mean you are like less than in terms of the same opportunities as other of your fellow colleagues, for instance. So, I mean, when we're starting to have these dialogues and conversations around talking about what does it exactly mean, what should trade unions do, what should a place take into consideration when it wants to make sure that it creates a safe, affirming space for its workers. So they need to of course, there need to be like policy reviews and things like that. I mean, for example, for a lot of LGBTI people, when they have to be when they have to be at work, most likely they're not allowed to necessarily share this part of themselves because of the fears of discrimination. So as an organization or as a business, they need to keep into account about what can they do to make that certain individual feel more comfortable. Well, I mean, if you're an LGBTI person and you find yourself in a space where you're not allowed to fully express yourself, of course, the results of that could be you actually being more vulnerable to actually having mental health issues around that because you're constantly reminded that who you are, it's less than. And more so, whatever space you're giving and working in, it's not even representing this part of your life. So in that regard, you don't feel affirmed, you don't feel welcomed, and you're very vulnerable for being taken for, advantage. But then also to flip it as a business as well. I mean, it's their responsibility to make sure that if, let's say, a colleague gets discriminated against, somebody gets called a very ugly term about who they are, and if you really think about it, it's supposed to be the business's responsibility to make sure that the place is a safe environment. I mean, if you look back in terms of what we did with race issues, what we did with gender issues, so now it's about time that SOGI also takes part. And as a business, they need to know that there's got to have a policy that says it's okay to be who you are, so that if a colleague perhaps maybe violates another colleague based on their sexual orientation, the business can actually say, but we have made sure that everybody is equal here, that everybody here gets treated fairly. And then the responsibility then falls onto the specific culprit. No, definitely. I mean, I think the thing is like somebody has to start somewhere. So typically we start usually at the top. These are influencers. These are people with a sense of power of saying, we are falling behind in terms of this, so we need to start having these conversations. So on a top level, it's understandable, but then eventually it needs to now translate itself onto the ground because people who are working in the corporate, in their offices, they get opportunity to have these conversations. But people, the working class of that specific company, what is there specifically that is available for them? So they need to also like review the policies on the ground to some of like a person who works at a 9 to 5 at a petrol station and they work for Shell, for instance. But if this person, how do we make sure that this person also feels affirmed and welcomed? So therefore we look at that specific, what is being done in their work. Whatever meetings they have, are issues discussed? Are they integrated? Do they talk about making people understand that there's diversity within gender and sexual orientation? And in that regard, there's a bit of things that are trickling down to the ground. And I mean, also, I think it's also around, we need to also stop just looking at it from a top to bottom thing, but also do it both, like bottom to up and top to bottom, where even people on the ground themselves, they need to be sort of like empowered and encouraged to specifically say what they want and what are their needs. And that conversation needs to happen, and that conversation can be taken up, and things can be designed for them. I mean, like trade unions, I mean, even in the South African context, the history of South Africa, trade unions are very powerful machines in terms of like bridging the gap of injustices, of saying this is not right, this is not correct. And now the issue is like, certain issues get prioritized over others. You know, we've got issues like race and gender issues and things like that, and social economic and classes and all those kind of things. But when it comes to LGBTI issues, it's very very uh, the procedure is very slow, largely because people, the runners of these trade unions, some of them are actually still trapped um, in very problematic ways of thinking around SOGI, around sexual orientation and gender identities. So those key players, they need to be trained and they need to see the prioritization of understanding LGBTI issues. Not just saying, yes, they're discriminated, let's include them, but also actually understanding what does it mean to be LGBTI in a space that's very oppressive. That when they push a certain agenda about gender issues and things like that, but they integrate LGBTI issues across all issues, because it's not only just a standalone issue. No, I think the LGBT Business Summit is very important to have it, and I think it should happen actually even more frequent, and in it also be more inclusive of people from different levels. Shouldn't only just be caught up in just on a very corporate level only, but it also needs to be have people on the ground to come and speak for themselves. About their challenges in the same space, so that we don't always fall into a track of making making decisions for people, but we need to hear people's stories from the ground and them being on this platform talking about their